Good morning, everyone. That was still a little bit decaffeinated, I think. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rick Metters. I'm with Fidelity Investments. We are honored to be presenting corporate partner of the Expanded Learning Time Summit. You are in the Mentorship and Civic Engagement breakout session. If you are looking for another session, you're in the wrong room, so giving you fair notice. At the start of the session, I want to indicate that we will be taping this in the back. I'll let everyone know that, and want to make sure that you all understand that the views of the panelists are their own and not of any of the presenting sponsors, none of the nonprofits or the corporate partners. And it says, and not the institutions you represent. So it may not even be your own opinion for all I know.
It feels like a Jerry Springer lecture. In other words, disregard everything we have to say.
Exactly, and I think since we are just mere steps from Congress, you do have unanimous consent to revise and extend your remarks as needed as well. No C-SPAN geeks in the audience, clearly. Oh well. Once again, my name is Rick Metters. I'm from Fidelity Investments. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Community Relations. And rather than going into lengthy introductions, all of our bios are in the rather extensive speaker bio book that you can get at the check-in desk. I think at the outset I can tell you that I have a little bit of a Wayne's World flashback when I did read the speakers' bios, that I was about to get on my knees and just say, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. We have an impressive group of folks here this morning to share with you their knowledge and expertise about mentorship and civic engagement. By quick means of introduction, what I'll do is we will tell you a little bit about our personal journeys in mentorship and civic engagement and how they affect or lead to our own theories of change in this space. As I mentioned, I work at Fidelity Investments. My primary responsibility is connecting Fidelity employees for opportunities to serve. We focus on education and financial education, and so I get to work with outstanding nonprofits across the country, including Citizen Schools, with whom we've had a 17-year partnership, in which during that time, 1,500 Fidelity employees have served as mentors through a variety of apprenticeships. Before that, I worked for over 20 years with Boys and Girls Clubs at a local level and a state level. And clearly that informs my perspective. David and I are chuckling. Our roots go back to Massachusetts, where we had more than one candid discussion about mentorship, if I recall, David. And last but not least, I also end up sitting on I'm an elected school board member as well, so I have that perspective. And as my wife would indicate, I'm married to a teacher, so trust me when I can tell you that I'm living this pretty much 24/7. So pleased to be here, pleased to be a moderator, and humbled to be among this group. So with that, we'll turn it over to Jason Cascarino from Spark. Jason.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning. By way of introduction, I am also married to a teacher, and not only that, but a middle grades teacher. So I get a lot of this rhetoric every day. Which is great. By way of introduction on how I got into sort of mentoring and leading a national youth mentoring organization, I'll talk about three quick my mentors. My high school golf coach. I used to play golf in high school. I don't play golf anymore since I had kids. But the saying that always sort of sticks in my mind is he said something. He said, "Don't think about a pink elephant." And when you think about don't think about a pink elephant, the first thing that pops in your mind is a pink elephant, right? So his whole idea was like you're standing on the tee, and if you think, okay, don't hit the ball out of bounds, you're going to hit the ball out of bounds. So it was sort of taught me how to sort of think not only positively, but in a very sort of solutions-oriented way. Another one was a college professor teaching history and politics, really thinking about how to think critically about the world, about our place in it. And then finally, my first boss, who I had started my career in national security and made the leap into education. And my first boss sort of did the same and really took me on as he was my mentor and how to sort of apply the skills that I had learned in analytics and in how to organization change to the field of education. And so I made the leap into education, worked for an outfit called New American Schools here in Washington, D.C., work for Citizen Schools. I think everybody has. A lot of people have anyway. Here, we employ a lot of Citizen Schools. There's a big Citizen Schools diaspora here in this country, and a lot of us doing kind of great things. And then moved to Chicago, worked for the Chicago Public Education Fund, worked on the foundation side, and then took over for the founder of Spark in January a year ago. And I kind of kept characterizing myself as the second stage guy, kind of taking over for the founder and trying to think about scale and sustainability and so forth. And so that's my journey to Spark. But leading a national mentoring organization where everybody, I think, is very connected to mentoring and has great stories about mentors. So it's really meaningful to lead an organization where that's built on mentoring.
Good morning. My name is Michael Holthouse. I'm a little bit unique in here in that I am a serial entrepreneur. I've started and grown a number of quite successful technology companies, sold one to HP and one to Sprint, which put me in a position to really focus on my next major career in life, which is really centered around at-risk youth. To do that, I took a year and a learning journey around our country and a number of places around the world. And I went and saw right at 100 different programs that were world-renowned around how do you focus on the issues of at-risk youth, and most specifically around middle school youth. I learned an awful lot. I learned a lot about the roles of mentors and really what is the education. You know, when you talk to the world, they say, well, the answer is education. Well, of course it is. But most Americans think of education as academics, reading, writing, math, science. And as it turns out, academics does not correlate to life success. Life success is really correlated in a whole different kind of learning. And I've learned a lot about that, and we've started a bunch of programs centered around that. One specifically called Lemonade Day. Lemonade Day teaches kids how to start their own business using a lemonade stand. But that's not really what Lemonade Day is. It's really teaching them a process of how they can take ownership of their own life and achieve their own American dream. We're now in 56 cities across the U.S. We're in 12 countries. We've served about 800,000 kids in a really life-changing way. And I'm looking forward to connecting with you and telling you more about that.
Guys, David, why don't you grab one of the microphones? We have a couple in the back.
Oh, sure.
So one for this.
Yeah. I've never been accused of needing a microphone. But do you guys want to sit? You want to sit? Okay, because you certainly can. You want me to actually use it? Okay. Yeah, I mean, in trying to think about this question, I sort of thought about two things, I guess, in terms of personal connection. So when it comes to mentoring, I think a lot of us, when we come to this work, we either come from a place of plenty or a place of realizing, having not had this, how much it's needed. I come from definitely a place of privilege when it comes to mentoring. I really can't remember a moment of isolation as a kid. I lived in communities and went to schools where actually probably too many adults were asking you if they could be of service, which is an interesting kind of supply and demand issue. On the one side of the spectrum, we have helicopter parents, and on the other side of the spectrum, we have kids who are in isolation. So thinking about how to disrupt that supply and demand is interesting. But I also am just a sort of masochist. So these are the two M's in my life. As a mentor, I'm a mentor for a young man in Boston named Keontae, going into my 6th year with him. And I learn more from him probably than anything I do any day, as well as from my sons in terms of just humility about the complexity of his world. And how we talk about these things in academic terms, but watching them play out for him and his family takes away a lot of the generalizations and judgments and academic kind of approaches we may have to mentoring and to solutions and thinking that we have answers that are the panacea. So that's very real for me. My wife is a financial aid advisor in the Boston Public Schools. I feel like everybody's paying homage to their wife, and I definitely married up, so I should do that as well. And so a lot of what she brings to me is the complexities of not only getting in, but paying for and persisting in college and what that's like for families of all different situations. In some ways, I think that because mentoring has been made to be such sort of a simple panacea and solution to everything, it is the mentoring people who need to be the most skeptical and intentional about it. And so I think I talk about sort of like this complexity and humility in the face of the complexity of people's lives, and especially people in economic distress, because I think we have to have that healthy amount of humility as we sort of approach mentoring, and think that just getting people into a relationship and hoping there's magic in the pan, as it may have been for you naturally, is not the way we should necessarily approach intentional mentoring relationships between strangers. And then at the end of the day, the organization I represent, but I guess not today in the silly things that I say, is Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. And our ultimate masochism is that we think we're better together as a movement, much of what you're trying to do in expanded learning time here together, and that the thousands of mentoring organizations in America that are using mentoring for a million different ends, when they're together talking about the fact that we get rigor and relevance really right, but normally we don't pay any attention to the third R of relationship, that if we were to get rigorous about relationship as a movement and as a tool within many of our systems, we could actually make a huge amount of difference, and at a much more economically efficient level from an economic and a justice standpoint. So that's sort of what Mentor does, and we'll get more into that. Here, Robert.
Good morning. So my name is Robert Simmons. I'm the Chief of Innovation and Research for the DC Public Schools. I'm also a recovering academic. And so prior to that, I was a teacher and an administrator in the Detroit Public Schools. And my journey to mentoring was a byproduct of seeing my father incarcerated all of my life in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, even though he had a degree from Morehouse. And so I lived the experience of having a mentor who's still my mentor, and I grew to appreciate what that meant, even when I made bad choices, and he allowed me to make those choices, but was always there to pick me up to go forward. And so from there, I grew a mentoring program when I was a teacher called the Lunch Buddy Program, where we partnered with local business folks to work with students at lunchtime, but also created an internal system in the Detroit Public Schools for teachers to be mentors, to kind of incubate the idea that teaching is more than, as you mentioned, kind of the rigor and relevance, but also it's about relationship, right? And so what are the things that we can use from the mentoring world to improve the academic success and social and emotional development, largely for males of color in urban communities? And so from there, I was the founding director of a large research center called the Center for Innovation in Urban Education at Loyola University, Maryland, up in Baltimore, and helped build a mentoring program between the university and several schools in Baltimore called the Scholars Program, where the students as young as 5th grade, and part of it was the idea that it's too late to talk about college and career readiness for students who've never seen it before in 9th and 10th grade. Like, you have to start young. And so the students would literally come to campus, and I worked with a colleague of mine at Morgan State to construct this project. And from there, I chased that kind of silly carrot around tenure and promotion, and received tenure in education and African American studies. And then the chancellor of the schools was really an advocate for issues around equity and asked if I would come and work for her. And so as Kaya Henderson is Kaya Henderson, I said, sure, I'll think about that. And yes, I'll do that. And so my office, so as a result of that, I was charged with designing the Empowering Males of Color initiative for the DC Public Schools, which has been adopted by the city. It's been talked about at the White House. And so we have collaborated in multiple buckets, including a mentoring through literacy program with our friends, the Reading Partners, Higher Achievement, Mentors Inc., For the Love of Children, and my staff is going to kill me because there's like a whole bunch of other people that we work on with this. We're working with schools to have folks mentor young people in the schools directly, but we're also taking a new track where we're working with the police department to reimagine the relationship between largely the Black community in Ward 7 and Ward 8 and MPD, where we're kind of helping to manage that and support MPD in doing that. And so from there, we're also launching a single gender school for boys in Ward 7 in Washington, D.C., and we're also doing an internal grant program, some early childhood work, and a variety of other things in collaboration with members of the community, school community, higher education, and so on and so forth. So.
Thank you, gentlemen. I know at the outset, I think it might be important, and we've touched on this a little bit in each one of our remarks, how are we defining mentorship here? I think that's a critical question, because there seems to be, in what we're speaking of, almost a continuum of mentorship, and maybe if we define the term, is it informal, formal, structured, unstructured, short-term, long-term, et cetera? Is it too blanket a term in some respects, and is that impeding us?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at Mentor, sometimes people sort of treat us like the purveyors of good taste, like they're asking us, is this mentoring, is this not? And I often tell them, I think that's the wrong question. I mean, I think two things are at play that you mentioned, Rick. One is that we don't have awesome and evolved language around this, so we do tend to use the words mentoring for everything. Sometimes people mention natural mentoring to me, and I say, so what, all other mentoring is unnatural? I mean, it's sort of, we don't have great language. We certainly know that going all the way back to, Greek mythology, there is this notion, and overmothers and lots of different terms in different communities, there has been this notion that people take responsibility for children that aren't their own in some way. Sometimes that happens naturally in communities, and sometimes it has to happen through systemic interventions. And so, I mean, what we've come to call it is sort of structured mentoring or unstructured mentoring. But I think the most important question is not, is it mentoring or not? The most important question to me is, what are you trying to do with mentoring? Because that's usually where the misalignment is. Either someone just wants to do mentoring because it feels good, or they've got adults that are excited about it and they don't even know if kids want it or need it, or they just feel like it's the next thing to throw against the wall, like it's a way to attract people. I had a lot of nonprofits come to us, you sort of strip away everything, and it's more of like a fundraising or community engagement strategy. It's not actually really something that the young people need. So the thing I always say, and I think this is a place where the mentoring movement in some ways has evolved too, but needs to get further, and I think the academics are helping us figure this out too, is mentoring has been used like a blunt instrument, it should be used like a scalpel. So we need to ask ourselves, what kind of mentoring for what kids, for what outcome? To me, that's the question, not sort of what is mentoring or not.
I think in the simplest terms, mentors are those who can teach us something, where we don't have others in our life that can teach us that. Our first mentors are our parents. Sadly, in a lot of situations, maybe dads are gone, maybe moms are working 3 jobs. They can't do it, won't do it, aren't able to do it, so we've got to get others who can teach them. Coaches are great mentors and have been mentors throughout time, and teachers and next door neighbors, this whole notion that it takes a village. Mentors can be long-term, which most people think in terms of long-term. But mentors can also be short-term, where they can pass on specific knowledge about specific subjects at the right time in that child's life. When I look at the role that mentors play most importantly, it comes in this thing that I mentioned earlier, the difference between the two kinds of education. Mentors, yes, can teach us math and they can teach us science and help in those specific areas. But I think most, where they come in most, is that they know things about life and that they can help kids frame what's going on with them and how they can think about it and what are tools and things that they can use to help them grow. So mentors are vitally important, but I don't think that relationship has to be a long-term one.
I just wanted to comment quickly on what David, you sort of talked about the outcomes and mentoring as sort of a means to drive certain outcomes. And I just wanted to relate the experience that we've had at Spark. So we have about 2,000 mentors right now across the country, working with middle grades kids to help them prepare for high school through meaningful project-based experiences in their workplace. And what we hear from the mentors is that they want to know what outcomes that we're driving at, because they want to be a part of that mission. And so whether it's structured mentoring or unstructured, I think so long as the mentor has an understanding, and I've been a mentor, you've been a mentor for young people, as long as we have sort of an understanding of what it is that we're trying to do in their development. In our case, in Spark's case, is trying to get them on track for high school. So it is around engaging them, making sure that they're attending school, they're working on interesting projects that get them fired up about their learning. That does have a rising tide effect on their grades and their attendance and their behavior. And then those sort of practical, how do you select the right high school and be prepared for high school. I, as a mentor, as long as I know kind of those are the specific tangible outcomes that we're trying to drive, and I have the coaching and training that I need, that I think makes the mentor experience really powerful and meaningful for the mentor as much as it is for the young person.
Well, Rick, and if I could just add one other thing, I think the golden rule really is not to create another abandonment in a kid's life. I mean, that's sort of, I think short-term mentoring does work, but the reason why people have such an aversion to it is because often a young person has been promised more, and then they get short-term mentoring as sort of a compromise, and now it's another unfulfilled relationship in a life that may already be filled with transience and may already be filled with not enough people sticking around. It's like the great hope is here, and then the great hope is never around again. And so the most important thing is just that we're incredibly intentional and careful, and almost in a medical way, a do no harm ethical way around entering into mentoring. Because the last thing we want to do is overpromise.
So it's transparency about the commitment level, whether it's 1 hour, 1 day, 1 month, 1 year, et cetera.
To the kid and the adult.
Exactly.
Yeah, because
Yes.
I think we communicated to the adult, and the kid's left wondering, like, you should just be happy this guy's showing up.
Mm-hmm.
But no, you shouldn't. You should understand what kind of relationship you're getting into.
Setting the expectation and make sure it's clearly communicated. Now, Robert, I think David threw the gauntlet at the academic community that you guys, meaning you represent the entire academic community. You don't represent yourself,
I'm a
but the entire
recovering
academic
academic.
community. In terms of defining terms.
Yeah,
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think when I was an academic and I decided to study mentoring in the context of urban education, specifically looking at African American Latino boys, one of the things is I looked at places both in school and out of school. And so this paper that I wrote was all about what mentors learn from students, because I think that there's a level of a cultural IQ that's needed depending on the cultural context of community and space and place, right? So in other words, if I think about my mentees in Baltimore, even though the 3 guys that I still mentor were African American, I'm African American man from Detroit, right? And so like, what about my cultural IQ needed to be raised so that I could understand the space and place that they operate in East Baltimore, right? And so I found that is a dimension of mentoring as an academic that's often missed, right? Like people will say like, well, are you saying that African American boys only need African American male mentors? And that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that you need a level of an IQ, a cultural IQ, to understand what are the dimensions of saying, yes, you can start a business, but in a world where you can go to Harvard as an African American man and then get pulled over by the police, like you can't just say, well, the police didn't mean it that way as a mentor. Like that's absurd, right? Like you have to be able to translate for that student, like here are the things that you need to do when you interact with the police, and then be unapologetic about we live in a steady, sturdy, racist society. So when the police pull you over, like, this is what I was taught by my uncles and my mother, like, leave your hand, he's laughing, right? Yeah, this is true, right? Leave your hands up here, and you say to them, like, I'm getting ready to reach for my wallet, is that okay? Because I don't want to get shot today, right? Like, and part of it is, as a mentor, you have to have the ability to be vulnerable. You have to have the ability to acknowledge your own limitations and levels of privilege that your young person you're mentoring perhaps doesn't experience. And I think that in my experience as an academic, I have found the mentoring community, both practitioners and people who have studied this, to be very silent around issues of race and like culture and like these complex dimensions that help young people make sense of the world. And so I don't know that as an academic community we provided all the answers, but I do think looking at work around critical race theory or looking at Jeffrey Duncan Andrade's work out in Oakland, and there's multiple people who have discussed this. And for me, I also discuss it in the historical context. When I wrote my dissertation, I wrote about African-American teachers and the role of other mothering. And like, how does other mothering actually impact the teacher-student relationship, right? Where they were race cheerleaders, they were this, they were that. It was more than sit down, shut up, open the book, take the test. Like being a teacher was, in fact, if you think pre-1954 in the Black community, you were a mentor. Like, nobody studied it, nobody did research on it, but the fact remains that these people were very successful. So, I mean, in the academic community, there are people who are writing about it and trying to figure it out, but I think that in my experience as an academic, I wrote about it in kind of a multiplicity of ways, but I also practice it using what I learned to say, okay, is this actually true? And like, again, I want to focus on culture. And that's what I found to be very kind of a missing element of a discussion in the national conversation about mentoring, that this culture is just like, well, you know, I'll just mentor them and like tell them to, you know, pull up there, put on your big boy pants or big girl pants and like, you know, it'll be fine. But the fact remains that if it was fine, we wouldn't be repeating Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, blah, 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 blah. Like, how do you mentor a kid or a Black boy specifically when that's part of their reality? Like, it can't just be get over it or like just walk the other way or the police are your friend. Like, I don't know about that, right? So I think it's complicated. And so the academic community is wrestling with this just a bit. But I also think it's difficult to get the academic community to do this as someone who was an academic, because I don't necessarily think many academics understand mentoring, right? And so we typically as academics write about what we understand the most.
This is audience participation. Yep, absolutely. Now, we've talked about a little bit of, you know, honestly, a little bit of the deficiencies of where we are with mentoring. Let's flip it on its head a little bit. What, from your experience, gentlemen, have you seen as you know, I guess Gladwell was referenced by Larry Summers in terms of the 10,000 hours. I'll reference him again in terms of tipping points. So where do you see in terms of techniques, resources, approaches that, you know, are working? Because we have folks in this room that have an interest in mentoring, either practitioners or thinking of getting into this space. Where are those leverage points that we can really multiply the impact of what we're doing now? What do you see as promising in that regard?
I mean, I think a couple are in this room. I mean, Urban Alliance is in this room. Spark is in this room. I mean, I think so we've talked a lot about false debates. I think it's important we've been so transparent about false debates. But I also think just the fact that we're talking about some of the false debates is also the fact that we are evolving past some of the false debates about, you know, there is Bernadette Sanchez in Chicago is doing tons of research on mentoring and race and cultural IQ and sort of getting us past this debate about who can mentor whom and more into this debate about how is everyone prepared to bring their best self to a mentoring relationship and get into an empowering relationship with a young person where they're sharing power. How do we make sure mentoring is not sort of viewed as an antidote to something wrong with a community, but it pulls on the community's already social capital? So, I mean, I think there's more and more. I think there's innovations like youth-initiated mentoring where kids codify natural mentors that are already in their lives and figure out how to be sort of mentor magnets and be advocates and sort of create their own network. I think Spark, where you're combining introducing people to the world of work, young people to the world of work, as well as creating a relationship for them and people who can show them that industry and sort of turn them on to the relevance of school to work. So I think we're just building a lot of bridges, and I think the greatest sort of boon for mentoring is the way that a lot of organizations are wrapping it into a broader array of resources and theory of change. So there's this notion that standalone mentoring, which was what was practiced for decades and is really a wonderful model, but that there's limitations to just standalone mentoring, and that also very few interventions that bring adults together with kids are going to be as, you know, sort of impactful as we want them to be if they're not built around an intentional relationship. So it's sort of this idea as mentoring as part of a panoply of sort of interventions. I think that's where the growth is. That's where we see us having gotten from hundreds of thousands of kids in structured mentoring relationships to over 4 million, is that more and more organizations have embedded it as part of what they do. So that's where I feel like one of the greatest leverage points is.
Yeah, and not to totally overstate this, but I will anyway, is that I think, I don't know that we can be even successful at all as a country in the middle grades without mentoring. And the reason I say that is because for that mentoring, and particularly if you think about mentors in kids' lives, and particularly if it's focused mentoring around learning and development, and the kids are sort of doing project-based work with a guide, that is so tailor-made to what these kids need. We learned it from the early session earlier today, and oftentimes schools are just not structured to provide those kinds of experiences. They can to a certain degree, but getting kids out in places like work environments or in other environments and working one-on-one on hands-on, meaningful things that they are creating and they're getting recognized for it, I think that's an essential component of particularly this age range. And so I think to the degree that mentoring is powerful and it can work, and to think about best practices, I think we have an amazing opportunity to leverage mentoring and use it as a tool to target this critical issue of middle grades, which is underrepresented, it is underaddressed, it is underfunded in terms of the continuum of education. And I think mentoring can be a powerful solution for that.
Now, Michael, you have experience with growth and scale from your growing companies and being able to sell them to other major players. How does that experience inform what we're talking about now? How do you get from, I believe there's 16 million kids. I'm looking at David because I think I quoted from his article. I think it's 16 million kids without mentors. So how do we scale up to that problem? And how has your experience, Michael, inform that?
There are mentors in all kids' lives, whether they recognize them as such or not. I think what we have to do is go where the kids are, find out what their interests are, and then help them grow those interests into their future. Sadly, parents can't teach what they don't know. So in far too many situations, what they do is teach what they do know. And sadly, many of those teachings will lead the kids in the wrong direction. So what we have done, and what I've seen in a host of programs that we've rolled out, is to help kids understand what's great inside of them, and a lot of self-discovery, because every single child has magical and unique characteristics and capabilities that others don't have. And it doesn't matter if you were born rich or poor, urban or rural, or any other area you want to look at. The real key is finding other adults, coaches, community leaders, individuals that can work with them and help them take ownership of their own lives, because ultimately that's the only way that they succeed. If they view that they're dependent on the success of others, then that holds them back. So what we have to do is help expand their mind and do it in a way that is independent of race or creed or any other category, but connect with that child in a way of what's great about you, and how do we take advantage of your assets and use them for you to achieve whatever your American dream is.
So we only have a few more minutes, and we want to leave time for questions here. So if we go around one more time, if we were to frame the issues we're facing, what's needed most in this space? Is it policy? Is it leadership? Is it new approaches, tools, resources? If I gave you your one wish from the wish list, what would it be in this space?
Mentors. It's quite supply. Certainly for us, and I think for those organizations that do provide this kind of opportunity for both mentors and young people. Scale is a question I think about all the time as the leader of this organization, and I worry about. And it's basically a worry around the supply issue. And I know that Dave and I have talked about there's PR campaigns we can do to get people motivated to do mentoring. There also may be policy levers around incentives for I know that obviously companies are incentivized to do a whole host of things, whether it's stay in a certain community or to do green energy technologies and so forth. There may be ways to also incentivize them to volunteer. A lot of companies do prioritize volunteer, like your company and many others, but there may be ways to sort of incentivize even more to create the sort of a greater supply. And certainly from the report that David's organization put out, supply is I think the biggest challenge to wrestle with. As I think about scale for an organization like mine, the money question is always a big question, but I think it's a solvable one. The mentoring one is the one that I worry most about.
Thank you.
So as the Chief of Innovation and Research and thinking about managing the largest push for mentors in DC at this point, I would say there are two pieces. A, there's a supply issue, right? But also kind of managing the when mentoring happens has been one of our biggest challenges, right? And so if folks want to mentor on a Saturday, then we have to work with schools that have Saturday programs, or we have to figure out how to do out-of-school mentoring, right? And that is complicated by are they then governed by our background checks? Like, who does that? The other thing I will say for some local context is that we don't actually have the ability to go outside of our current background check system in DC. So for all those Washingtonians, will appreciate, because we aren't a state. That's a whole other conversation. So if anybody wants to give us statehood, then we can go do all sorts of other things. But that's another story. But because we have to use the FBI, at least at DCPS, like that, I mean, we aren't exactly their priority, right? So it slows down the process of folks getting clearance. And that can be problematic because as we roll it out, depending on how fast or how slow that works, the supply that we may have may dwindle because people might lose interest, right? And so I think that is problematic on a policy level. The last thing is that I think it's also a matter of having the people, if you're an organization where you don't, as a school system, we don't do like mentoring day in and day out. Like that is not necessarily what we do. So like having the capacity inside the organization to recruit mentors, work with reading partners and blah, blah, blah. I mean, that takes people, which in turn takes money. And so I think that those things keep me up at night, but also just in terms of making sure that we're clear about the outcomes. I think are also important as a organization that is really about teaching and learning, but also the social and emotional development of young folks.
So statehood is yours. I give you statehood. I'm for it. Whatever you want.
It's just been decreed, is it?
Yeah, it's been decreed. Yeah, well, you said we can represent any interest we want.
There you go.
Yeah, it's worth nothing. But my two children will be into it. So, I mean, apologies in advance, going to say a couple self-serving things here, but I think they connect with what people have said. There's legislation called the Child Protection Improvement Act that we've been trying to pass for 10 years, and Abby Evans, our Director of Government Relations, is in the back, that would actually make it so that people would get through FBI background checks very quickly so that you wouldn't lose them and they would be prioritized and they would be cheap and children would be safe. So any of you want to help us make that a priority with the U.S. Congress, it seems like an easy bipartisan thing for them to act on, and Abby's got all the tools on our website, Scott. But please, there's nothing controversial about the thing, and it's a tool that would be in everyone's toolbox to make it easier. The other thing I would say is to your point about expertise, and we've got Abby Ellis, who runs our Philadelphia Mentoring Partnership over there. One of the reasons sort of our founders said you can't build skyscrapers without infrastructure, one of the reasons we wanted to build the infrastructure of a mentoring movement, and the same way, again, you're building the infrastructure of an expanded learning time movement, is so that a school district wouldn't have to become experts on mentoring and wouldn't have to deal with 20 separate mentoring organizations. They could deal with someone who had expertise, who was an intermediary, so they had no direct service stake in the game who could actually line up at scale and have the expertise to train and do what they're doing in Pittsburgh and St. Louis and a lot of other places where the entire school system can take a system-wide approach to mentoring. So plug for sort of, intermediaries, often kind of the redheaded stepchildren of the nonprofit sector, but they're very helpful when you want to scale. And so we need to take mentoring seriously enough to build this kind of infrastructure. And we would love to get to 50 states with those. And then thirdly, I would say to actually answer your question and stop doing a commercial for Mentor and our agenda, I think that there really is a sort of systemic, I'm not sure if it's policy, but systemic reframing that will be needed if we're ever going to get there. I think we are still raising private money. We are still doing mentoring around the edges. And so, it's amazing what the mayor's doing. And it's amazing what you're leading. But we are still raising private money to do a mentoring effort for boys of color. And we are still doing a campaign for the mayor of Boston to get to 1,000 mentors. These are amazing things. But they are still not inventorying every child in third grade to see if they have a relationship with someone outside the home and then intervening with one. Or finding out why an 8-year-old is chronically truant from school and figuring out whether a mentor or home visits or other things systemically may change that tide. When we do that, a school that has city year maybe has somebody who goes and does that, but it's not systemic at all. And so to me, until we get systemic about relationship and the isolation of poverty and dealing with the isolation of poverty of school kids, and I think mentoring's just a really great response, one of a lot of responses. But until we get systemic there, until it's not this extra puppy dogs and rainbows, we only talk about mentoring either when a kid gets shot or when we want to do something really grandiose because our business community says we want to do something. Until it's a systemic thing, I think we will continue to nip at the edges and do amazing things, but we're not going to close the mentoring gap. We're going to have to get systemic about it.
Understood. I think during the midst of that question, I was handed a note saying that we have a little bit of extra time. So I think everything is expanded today. And so you do get to revise and extend your remarks. Who knew? With the diverse group of folks that we have in this room, what would be from your perspectives, your respective pieces of advice for them in terms of steps that they can take, actions they can take to move this effort forward? Because to your point, David, we don't have a system. There are pockets of kids that have a supportive ecosystem around them of caring, loving adults, but that's unfortunately all too often the exception rather than the rule. So, how do we get to those aspirational moments, and what would be your advice to that point? I'm giving you guys the easy questions, clearly, but...
I'm excited to hear questions from them, but I would just say be humble and leverage existing infrastructure. Those would be that seems to be the two things that, as I travel around the country in the world of mentoring, people struggle with. I think one, the lack of humility is just because, again, there are very few interventions with kids that we often also have naturally, So, people think mentoring is easy because, again, it happened to them. And so they don't think about it the way, we wouldn't start a school tomorrow if we don't know anything about schools, but we would start a mentoring program because we think we know about relationships. So I would just say be humble, and then I would just also say you'll find there are people out there with this expertise. You don't need to hire someone to go and learn everything there is about mentoring. Use the people who do this training. We have a National Mentoring Resource Center. Any nonprofit in America can request training in TA for free. The Department of Justice funds it, so money's not a barrier. But you can get training on this stuff. So leverage existing infrastructure and be humble.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a softball question. I echo everything David said. I think that the humility is critical, but I also think that understanding that mentors aren't necessarily teachers, but you also have to be a willing learner. And I think that's critical, but I also think that recognizing that in the research that has been done for the last 50 years, there is not a single bit of research that says parents don't want what's best for their children. There's no that can't be said, right? What can be said is how that it's translated to folks in schools is very different, right? And the translation of that often is in some language unknown to the two parties in there was a book called The Essential Conversation. It's all about the relationship and the dynamic between parents, schools, and teachers. And I think that's a must read for folks as we look to expand our understanding of that dimension. But I also think that I've taken a great interest in understanding for parents, what do they see in themselves that they want to translate and transfer to their children? Because I always say that, you know, for parents who are in economically challenging situations, and I think about my career teaching in Detroit, yeah, some of my parents didn't come to parent-teacher conferences, but I also don't think parent-teacher conferences is a great measure of whether you care about your kid. I think it's a measure of access and privilege, right? Like, if you can walk away from your $13 an hour job to go to parent-teacher conferences for 30 minutes, then, like, Child Protective Services is going to call you because you don't have enough money to keep the lights on, but then the school is calling you because you didn't come. So you're like, damned if you do, damned if you don't. So I think for me, it's very important to acknowledge the role that families play, and then figuring out how do we work with parents and families so that they can have a supportive environment. And I don't necessarily think that happens with mentoring organizations exclusively or school systems, but that requires an extensive conversation with social service organizations, with city government, with the Boys and Girls Club, because it's more complicated than that. I think it's overly simplistic. Having spent 20 years in education, both in schools and as a researcher, it's overly simplistic to simply kind of be dismissive of parents. Like, I think that's dangerous because, like, who are we to make that judgment? Because it's very subjective. Like, my mother worked 2 jobs, had a degree from Spelman, and there were days that I did not see her because she would come home. I was being raised by my mother and my grandmother, but I knew my mother loved me. And I'll be damned if somebody's going to say, well, because she wasn't there, like, that she didn't care. That just meant she was trying to put food on the table for me. So I think that it's complicated. And I think as we think about mentoring, how do we engage parents, not just students, in this whole discourse around mentoring?
Gentlemen, yeah.
One way that we've done a little bit of that engagement, and one thing I would offer to the group is to celebrate the mentoring experience. At Spark, we have these things called discovery nights or discovery events, and it's at the end of a 10-week project-based learning apprenticeship with a mentor and a student. They gather together at a school or often at a community site, and it's like this science fair, career fair mashup, and you kind of go around. But what's great about them is that it is a tool for not only the students to celebrate their own learning and to sort of teach back. And by the way, the thing that they talk about the most is actually not their project, it's their mentor and the relationship that they had with the mentor, which is it's really powerful to see. But it's also an amazing tool for parents, families, and the school to engage with each other around student learning. I've been to these events all around the country, and just the celebratory nature of them, it brings smiles to their faces, and it really does engage parents and families and the community in a way that's really centered around learning. So it's not just a one-off assembly or a one-off kind of meeting or something. It's really sort of centered around learning. It can be really powerful. So I think celebrating the mentoring experience is a great tool.
I hesitate to really bring this up because there's kind of an underlying piece that's in the center of the room here, maybe the elephant that we're not talking about. And that is that we're talking a lot here about mentoring and how do we supply resources and knowledge and capabilities and help to all of these kids that aren't getting it. Well, why aren't they getting it? Part of it is economic. Part of it's because maybe they care or maybe they don't care. We have the number of children born outside of wedlock is at astronomical rates. Somehow, as a society and as a people, we have to begin to hold the families accountable in meaningful ways. They got to spend time, and they've got to care, and they got to show up. And that is the very basis of what mentoring was always designed to be. I don't have the solutions, but the fact that we're not talking about it in here is troubling, because that's the real issue. That's why we're talking about mentoring, is because we don't have the parents and the adults really engaging in meaningful ways.
I don't know.
That's just my.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know we want to go to questions, but I would just say I don't know that I agree with you on two fronts. One, that we're not talking about it, because I think Robert just talked about it quite a bit in terms of parents' ability to be present and the way we judge them for their presence, which may have nothing to do with their love or caring. I think also there's a part of mentoring, because again, the only reason I respond is because I think you're getting into sort of, at least in my opinion, a sort of time-honored false debate, which is that somehow mentoring is a response to kids who don't have enough adults who love and care about them. Mentoring is a lot about bringing other worlds into kids' lives. It's not a deficit sort of response. If we view it as a deficit response, then we will never be successful, because the mentor will always be the enemy or the response of bad parenting or broken families. A lot of kids, naturally for me, my parents were resource brokers for me. They had the disposable time and lack of pressure on their lives to resource broker for me. A lot of kids have parents who love the hell out of them, but aren't in a position, either don't have the social or economic capital to be as much of resource brokers. They're resource brokers of love and caring, but they're not able to be resource brokers of other worlds, and they may not be able to be present at school meetings that all take place at 2 o'clock. And so I just think mentors can be an asset-based thing and more of an accent to a family that already loves and cares, instead of response that something's broken. I'm not saying there's nothing broken in America with families of every economic strata, but I'm just saying I don't think that's the main reason for mentoring, is that we have a crisis in the family.
And what's interesting, I think we talked about materials that folks can read. I'm in the middle of reading Robert Putnam's new book, Our Kids. And I think there's a really thoughtful discussion about the interplay between, let's say, family instability and poverty and some of the effects of that, but in a way of addressing it in more of an asset-based approach to it. So I would definitely recommend Putnam's book. Would plug Eric Schwartz's book, The Opportunity Equation, as well. And I think they both approach it from a slightly different perspective, but a very thoughtful analysis and contribution to this dialogue. And speaking of dialogue, we want to open up to all of you. I think we've had a few minutes in which we've been able to go back and forth. But Michelle Ahaus from Citizen Schools has the mic, and this is your opportunity to engage our panel.
Thank you very much. I think it's still morning. Good morning.
If I can just ask people to introduce themselves and if they have an affiliation and stuff as well. Thank you so much, Gail. I appreciate it.
Good morning. My name is Gail Jessup White. I'm with Higher Achievement. And Robert, I'd like to say that what you said clearly resonated with a lot of people about cultural IQ. As a mother of a 22-year-old who grew up in a privileged home, who is an MIT grad, it is sickening and frightening for me to worry about him every single day because of what's happening across the United States of America. So it's really important that as those of us who are involved in education and who know about mentoring, learn how to address this. And that leads me to my question and something you said, Michael, that mentoring is about teaching, and young people learn from us. So I ask the panel what we can institute to help young people challenge racial injustice and social injustice, because they know it's there. What can we teach them to help them without scaring them? Because my 22-year-old is scared, and he doesn't come from a challenged home. So what programs can we institute to help them without frightening them? And furthermore, how can these programs be instituted to have social impact? Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Any hand raisers on that one, folks?
Well,
Jason's got the mic. You're good. Got the comm.
One of the things I would say is I've been amazed by the young people in our program. So we pair young people with a mentor, and it's in a variety of companies. They could be at Google, or they could be at Deloitte, or it could be technology companies, business companies, all sorts of companies, and they work on a project together. But the project is self-directed. That is, it's what the student is interested in, because it's a big part of the middle grades, right? Is their own sort of identity formation. And I've been just blown away by the number of students and from very challenging communities who want to do things to help others and to help people within their community. There are some that speak to some social justice issues, but also just sort of the broader issues around supporting the communities that they're from. They want to build. One young man wanted to build a sort of an anti-poverty business, sort of partnering with local food stores and so forth. And so and he worked with a Deloitte consultant to actually build a business plan around this. But so he's learning skills and he's building a relationship with the mentor. But his inspiration was really within his own context. And I think for having a program like Spark that provides an outlet for that kind of creative energy to sort of foster that kind of spirit and interest in community and what it is that they're trying to do to support their own community has just been amazing. I would say that by far has been one of the most interesting and powerful common threads in these experiences that the young people have.
I mean, I don't know if there's a program that can address that, of which you speak, because I think that's it's bigger than that. But I do think, and maybe this is the idealist in me, and it's also based on personal experience, I do think, young people are navigating an increasingly complex journey, and especially if they're African-American males, based on what they're seeing every night, is probably, if it doesn't resonate with what they see every day, is making it even more complex. And so I think there's something about somebody being present in the moments where there isn't a moment of crisis, in the quieter moments, and I know that's happened to me plenty of times in a mentor, where a young man asked me either what it means to be a man, or whether it's okay to go protest the shooting of somebody, or just trying to figure out where their place is and what's going to put them at risk and what's productive. And to your point about cultural IQ, I mean, this is a young black man asking a white guy, how do I respond to Eric Garner? I mean, it's sort of a mind twist if you think about it, but I'm just a guy who's shown up for him for 6 years. So, well, I mean, I think my initial reaction was to be scared for him if he were to go protest, my sort of gut, and then I got myself back off that ledge and said, tell me more, as I would with my own kids or anybody I loved, tell me more about this protest and what it is and what they're asking you to do. And once I found out he was going to Government Center in the middle of Boston to protest, I said, man, you should go down there and let your voice be heard. Do you want me to come? I think my son's at that same protest. Yeah, there you go. I would have met him maybe. But I think, I think it is about these quiet moments when kids are able to make sense of what they're seeing, or you to tell them that it doesn't make any sense. But kids are going to respond. I mean, we're all going to respond. So the question is, who's present for them to help them make sense of their response? I think that's the best program, is having adults around to help them make sense.
So one thing I will say is that, with all due respect to my folks in teacher education, I loved my time as a professor in AFAM studies, right? Because we got busy with challenging the system, right? Like figuring out, like, as an African-American studies professor, what didn't work, and like telling folks, like, literally, I will get tenure on my feet, not on my knees, right? Like, I will not be afraid. So part of it is giving young people a sense of history, right? And understanding that what we see with Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin is not new, right? And so my mother was involved with SNCC when it transitioned to CORE, when she was a student at Spelman in 73, 74. And one of the things she always says is that issues of race and racism are as American as militarization and apple pie. Like, it is a part of our DNA. And she said, so what I want you to understand at 40 years old, blah, 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 like, I am afraid for you as a 63, 64-year-old black woman still living in the city of Detroit, and you're in Washington, D.C. but she couches that in understanding history. And I truly believe that young people don't have a sense of history, because my commentary, when I've had students that I've mentored say, well, tell us about when you were protesting back in the day, or when your mother was protesting. I literally pull out pictures, and I still have a vivid black and white of my grandfather taking my mother and my two uncles to watch Detroit burn during the social uprising. Not the riot, which is a whole other conversation, right? When folks get sick and tired of being sick and tired, that's a social uprising. But that's another conversation, right? But the reality of it is that these young folks didn't have a sense of history. Like, they didn't understand that if you watch Selma, there was a point to marching across the bridge. Like, there was an outcome, right? Which was, we want to get folks access to voting. They could have chose housing, but they chose voting. So I said to them, like, I get it, I'm down with it. Like, during the Million Hoodie March, I went to New York when I was an academic. Like, I get it, I'm down for you. But so what? Like, what do you want to have happen? Do you want to have community oversight of the police? Do you want to have, like, what should happen? Should we teach about this in schools? And when I was probably back in September, we were the first district in the country to offer a document about how do you teach about Ferguson, right? And so when I wrote that document, people are like, dude, are you crazy? And I was like, no, like, this is Washington, D.C., so, like, we can't just not do anything. And so part of it is getting young folks a sense of history, but also allowing parents of these boys and some of the girls have experienced great tragedy, especially in Detroit. This sister rolled up to this dude, was locked out of the house, or was locked out of her car, something crazy, and dude shot her and got off of something crazy, right? But the reality of it is we have to give parents permission, especially mothers, permission to be afraid. Like, it is okay to say, I'm afraid for you, son, because I love you. And I tell my mother, like, I don't want you to be afraid, but, like, some days when I see those cars in D.C. or quiet as it's kept in the suburbs of Maryland and Virginia pull up behind me, even if I'm not speeding, I'm afraid. And they don't care that I'm Dr. Simmons, Chief of Innovation and Research. They don't care. They're like, black man, we might pull you over, right? And I just think that, again, this is where you get to the mentoring pieces. It's not teaching them how to respond to that, right? But it's about giving them the space to say, tell me more, so that we could better understand how to help them process complex situations, because race and racism is complicated in 2014.
Okay, unfortunately, just when we're getting going, we have to wrap up here. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I was going to do a point and a plug to end with, so you could make a point, but I think we've all had the opportunity to make points. But I will give some objective plugs. Jason Cascarino at sparkprogram.org?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Michael, Lemonade Day, is it lemonadeday.org? David, look, mentor.org, but look for the National Resource Center on mentoring as well. And a gratuitous plug for mentoring at the crossroads of education, business, and community. From a business perspective, this is a how-to, okay? And I wouldn't say that too often. And Robert, you have a book coming out, Disrupting the Pipeline from School.
African-American boys as critical intellectuals and scholars, but more importantly, in my real life, I don't really write that often anymore at that time, is check out emocdc.org, I think. Sarah Parker's in the back, probably knows I butchered it, or I got it right, I think, right, Sarah? Yeah, great. emocdc.org, and it's all about our empowering males of color. Shout out to Reading Partners, and shout out to Principal Zaki from DCPS, and Sarah Parker, any other DCPS people. Shout out to all y'all.
Outstanding. Hopefully we've had a panel with passion and purpose for you today. Couple quick housekeeping announcements. One, I want to thank Michelle, Rochelle, and Callie for their support for this panel, both before, during, and after. And also, quick announcement about the meals. We'll be heading back to where we started. And if you're a vegetarian, vegan, or have a food allergy, please stop by the registration table. There will be a specific color ticket that you'll pick up and put on your plate for the wait staff here. So thank you so much for your involvement, your participation, your attention. And we look forward to continuing the conversation at lunchtime. Thank you.